beneath the very ground that we're standing in, we were able to find the foundation for the exterior wall of Fort George. Now you're wondering, what's Fort George? Fort George was the fort that was here before Fort Monroe, before the lighthouse. And this archaeological find is huge. Now, Fort George was built around 1730, and unfortunately,
in 1749, a very large hurricane came and just wiped the whole thing out. So Fort George was the masonry fort that was here previous to Fort Monroe. And it was here to protect against the Dutch and the French and the Spanish and whoever else was here. And it was a pair of walls. There were 2 brick walls, 16 feet apart. I forget exactly how tall the outer wall was, but it was there with sand in between. They had these counter forts that are sort of there. They're sort of like buttresses in between them, and they filled them in with just infill and sand and things. It's pretty interesting. There's not a lot of information about it. The only real information we have is back from 1848 when Sir Robert Archer came out, Dr. Archer came out, and he actually measured what was left of the ruins, and he took measurements of the brick. He talked about the mortar, and he gave all that information to the Virginia Historical Society. We have the letter, and we were able to match the descriptions and measurements of the brick to the measurements that he took, but nobody knows where the plan is. That's just gone, unfortunately.
how did you find Fort George in the first place?
Way back in 1980, there was a contractor who was putting in something, I think it was electrical line, and they hit what they said was a foundation wall. Back then, there was really nothing there other than the museum, so they simply filled out a report and they gave it to Phyllis Brock, who was the person in charge at that point, and said, hey, we found this, and she went out and investigated and said, this is roughly in the area where we think Fort George might be, so you better leave it alone. So they backfilled it and left it alone. And then at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, the U.S. Army was required to make an account of all of their possible historic resources. And one of the things they did is they did a phase 1 survey of the entire post. And when the archaeologists came to do that, they looked at a whole bunch of old spot finds that they called them and said, well, this could possibly be from here, this could possibly be from there, let's test those out. And so they ended up testing that area, and they hit it again, and they called that Locus 15, and they theorized that that was one of the walls that was associated with Fort George. Later on, they did a ground penetrating radar survey in the area, and it seemed like there was more going out towards the road. So they enlarged that loci, and they basically said if there's any kind of ground disturbance in this area, this is an archaeologically sensitive area, it's a loci, make sure that you do your research before you do anything there. Building off of that and building off some of the other previous research, some of the old maps we were able to dig up, we're pretty confident that that's where Fort George is, especially because we found the outer wall. We think we may be able to find the inner wall as soon as we get that for sure and we measure in between and it matches what the information that Dr. Archer talked about. That will hopefully convince us. And the beauty of it is, once we find the inner wall and establish that, anything inside the inner wall is going to be possible living surface, which means we'll be able to dig down and hopefully find features that are associated with, outhouses and barracks and things like that. The last bit that could be very interesting is that typically militaries build their fortifications in the same area, And the history of fortifications here in this area go back to 1609 with the first fort here that was Fort Algernon. So the possibility exists that if we find Fort George in the course of finding the living surfaces, we could dig down deep enough and find the remains of Fort Algernon, which would be amazing.
What are some of the plans moving forward?
Right now, we have a award from a grant from the Park Service that has given us money towards this end, and a plan has been drawn up. It's in the very, very final stages. It is being impacted by what's going on now with the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard has to do some mitigation on the lighthouse, and as it turns out, they have to dig down deeper than we expected. So there's a little back and forth about that, and then once that gets ironed out, we will most likely have more investigations. They've been doing some ground penetrating radar behind the lighthouse. They haven't found much of anything yet, so I believe the next thing to do is to go back and reestablish the part of the foundations that we have, and then work out from there, sort of going from your known to your unknown, and then just kind of follow where the walls go.
What's been the biggest challenge with the project Fort George?
Like most projects, money. It would be great if somebody walked over and dumped millions of dollars on us so that we could do what we need to do. I would love to be able to go to England, where they have a lot of the records. We don't know if they have the colonial records here or not. Whatever colonial records were here were unfortunately destroyed. The capital was not in Williamsburg, it was elsewhere. But also Spain and the Netherlands and France, and any enemy of England at the time probably sent a spy who could have done a map. You never know. Popin's Colony found a map from 1608 that nobody knew existed in the Spanish archives. I've been told that there are places in the Dutch archives that are in the colonial period that nobody touches. It's just rows and rows and rows and rows of boxes. So to be able to have the money to either go there ourselves or hire other scholars would be great, but we don't have that. So we can only do the best we can do with what we've got. But that's primarily the biggest problem, I would say. And then the other thing is that it has been impacted many times by many storms, by many different construction events. You know, the lighthouse was probably built right on top of the ruins there. And then there were a number of batteries that were built. So we don't really know if the stones, if they're there, are even in their original context. So it'll be challenging even if we find the other parts of Fort George.
What just happened? This isn't what I was wearing. This isn't the same weather. What just happened? Thank you for watching Discover Fort Monroe. Make sure to follow our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can join me each Friday.